What if the HOA president who tried to evict you for fishing on your own lake discovered too late that you owned everything? Her road, her neighborhood, even her million-dollar dreams. Before we begin, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss stories like this. They tried to evict me from my own cabin for fishing on my own lake. The HOA president strutted onto my property in $1,000 heels, threatened to call the police, and demanded I stop disturbing the community. Little did she know, I wasn't just some squatter they could intimidate. I own the lake. I own the land her entire neighborhood sits on. Hell, I even own the road she drove in on to threaten me. By the time this was over, she'd lose everything. Her position, her reputation, her entire development scheme worth hundreds of millions. But it gets better. Comment below where you're watching from. Because the revenge I got was so perfectly legal, so beautifully calculated, that it restored my faith in justice. Here's how I turned the tables on a woman who thought she could steal my family's century-old property. It was a perfect Tuesday morning in late September. The lake was like glass, reflecting the fall colors that were just starting to show. I'd moved to this cabin 3 years ago after cashing out of my software engineering career early. Best decision I ever made. The cabin sits on 120 acres that my grandfather left me, including the lake. Yes, the entire lake. That detail becomes important later. I was enjoying my usual morning routine. Coffee, fishing, and absolutely zero human interaction when I heard the click, click, click of heels on gravel. I looked up to see this perfectly coiffed woman striding toward me like she owned the place. She had that particular brand of suburban authority that screams, "I peaked in high school student government." "Excuse me," she called out while still 50 feet away, her voice carrying that fake sweet tone that barely masks irritation. "Are you aware that fishing is prohibited in this area?" I blinked and looked around. My area, my lake, my dock that I built with my own hands. "I'm sorry, what?" I replied, reeling in my line slowly. She approached with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in her adult life. The Homeowners Association has recently enacted new regulations regarding recreational activities near residential areas. Fishing disturbs the peace and tranquility that our community members expect. I had to admire the delivery. It was like she'd practiced this speech in the mirror. "Ma'am, I appreciate the information, but this is private property." "My property specifically." I gestured to my cabin and the surrounding land. She looked at my modest log cabin like it was a condemned shack. "I understand. You may have been grandfathered into some sort of arrangement, but times change. We have standards now." "Standards?" As if my grandfather's 100-year-old cabin was somehow offensive to the McMansions that had sprouted up like mushrooms after rain on the far side of what she thought was community land. The woman extended a manicured hand. "I'm Karen Steinberg, president of the Pine Lake Homeowners Association." "And you are?" The way she said it made it clear she expected me to know who she was. "Jack Reynolds, and this is Reynolds Lake." I watched her face carefully as I said this. There was a flicker of something, surprise, maybe confusion, but it was quickly replaced by that practiced smile. "Well, Jack, regardless of what you call it, we're all part of the same community now. I'm sure once you understand how things work here, we'll get along just fine." She pulled out her phone and started typing. "I'm going to need to document this interaction for our records. The board will need to review your situation." Situation like my family's 100-plus-year ownership of this land was some kind of bureaucratic oversight. I stood up, my fishing rod still in hand. "Look, Miss Steinberg, I'm not trying to cause any problems, but I own this land, this lake, and this cabin. I have the deed going back to 1895. I'm not part of any homeowners association, and I don't plan to be." Her smile never wavered, but her eyes went cold. "We'll see about that, Mr. Reynolds. Sometimes people think they know more about property law than they actually do." She turned on her heel, those expensive shoes slipping slightly on the wet grass. "You'll be hearing from us soon." As she walked away, I noticed how she kept glancing back at my cabin, then at the lake view. There was something calculating in her expression that made my stomach tighten. I watched her black luxury sedan disappear down the gravel road. And for the first time in 3 years, the peaceful morning didn't feel so peaceful anymore. I'd spent those 3 years deliberately avoiding drama, enjoying the simple life I'd built here. But something told me that was about to change. The way Karen had looked at my place, like she was mentally redecorating, suggested this wasn't going to be a simple misunderstanding. I sat back down on my dock, but the fish weren't biting anymore. Probably because I was too busy wondering what Karen Steinberg was really after. Spoiler alert, it wasn't community standards. That evening, I found myself standing in my living room, looking out at the lake that had been in my family for generations. My grandfather used to tell me stories about this place, about the people who tried to claim what wasn't theirs. He'd always finish with the same warning. "Jackie, there will always be folks who see something beautiful and think it should belong to them instead of you. Remember that." I'd thought those days were behind us. Modern property law, official records, clear boundaries. Surely that would be enough. But as I watched the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and red, I had the distinct feeling that Karen Steinberg was just getting started. Her final words kept echoing in my head. "We'll see about that." Yeah, we definitely would. A week later, I found myself staring at an official-looking letter that had been slipped under my door. The envelope was thick, cream-colored with Pine Lake Homeowners Association, embossed in gold lettering. Very fancy for what amounted to a shakedown letter. The contents were even more impressive than the presentation. "Dear Mr. Reynolds," it began as if we were old friends. "Your recent activities have come to the attention of the Board of Directors. Fishing activities which were conducted without proper permits and in violation of newly established community standards constitute a breach of neighborhood harmony. Additionally, your structure appears to lack proper permits and violate several building codes recently adopted by the association. You have 30 days to comply with all regulations or face legal action." The letter was signed by Karen Steinberg in a flourish of navy blue ink. I had to read it twice to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Newly established community standards, proper permits for fishing on my own lake. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. They were treating my family's century-old property like some kind of illegal squat. I grabbed my truck keys and headed straight to town. If Karen Steinberg wanted to play games, I needed to understand the rules. My first stop was the office of Betty Nelson, the only lawyer in our small town who wasn't afraid to take on complicated property disputes. I'd met her a few times at the local diner, and she struck me as someone who didn't suffer fools gladly. When I walked into her office, she took one look at the HOA letter and started laughing. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," Betty said, pushing her reading glasses up her nose. "Karen's at it again." "Again? You know her?" I asked, settling into the chair across from her cluttered desk. "Know her, Jack? She's been a pain in my backside for 6 months. She moved here from Chicago, bought the biggest house she could find, and immediately decided everyone else was doing everything wrong." Betty spread the HOA documents across her desk like she was examining evidence. "The thing is, Jack, your property predates any of this. Hell, your grandfather's land grant predates the town itself. These people built their houses on what used to be pasture land. They have about as much authority over your property as my cat does over NASA." Betty pulled out a thick folder from her filing cabinet. "I've been keeping track of Karen's little empire-building project. She convinced 12 property owners to form an HOA, promising them it would preserve property values and maintain community standards. What she didn't tell them was that she had bigger plans. She showed me a survey map that made my blood run cold. Someone had been measuring my property, marking boundaries and noting structures. The surveyor's name at the bottom was Gerald Walker, Pine Lake Development Company. They've been planning something, Jack. This isn't just about fishing or building codes. Someone wants your land." The pieces were starting to fit together, and I didn't like the picture they were making. So what do I do? I asked. Betty leaned back in her chair. First, we establish your property rights beyond any doubt. I'll need you to dig up every piece of documentation you have. Deeds, surveys, tax records, everything. Second, we file a response to this ridiculous letter explaining that HOA regulations don't apply to your property. Third, we wait to see what they do next. She paused, studying my face. Jack, I have to warn you. Karen doesn't strike me as the type to give up easily. If she's got development partners involved, this could get ugly fast. Over the next few days, I became an amateur historian of my own property. I spent hours in my grandfather's old filing cabinet, which I'd barely touched since inheriting the place. What I found was remarkable. Not only did I have clear title going back to the 1890s, but the original land grant included mineral rights, water rights, and something called perpetual agricultural exemption. My great-great-grandfather had been smarter than I'd realized. Every document was properly filed, every tax paid on time, every legal requirement met. My family had been model landowners for over a century. Meanwhile, the HOA had been legally established for exactly 6 months and 14 days. On Friday, Betty and I met with the county clerk to verify all my documents. The clerk, an elderly man named Frank, who'd worked there for 40 years, whistled when he saw my file. Reynolds' property, huh? Haven't seen this folder in years. Your grandfather was a good man, Jack. Used to come in here every few years just to make sure everything was still in order. Smart fellow. Frank pulled out a detailed survey map from 1968. See this red line? That's your property boundary. These people complaining about your fishing, they're not even close to your land. In fact, he traced his finger along the map. Looks like they built their access road right through your property line. That was interesting. Very interesting. When I mentioned this to Betty, her eyes lit up. Oh, this is perfect. Not only do they have no authority over you, but they're technically trespassing every time they use that road. She made some notes in her legal pad. Jack, I think it's time we sent our own letter. A little reminder about who actually owns what around here. As we left the county office, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this whole mess started. Confidence. Karen Steinberg might have thought she was dealing with some backwoods hermit, but she was about to learn that my family didn't hold on to land for over a century by accident. That weekend, I did something I hadn't done in months. I invited some neighbors over for a barbecue. Not the HOA crowd, but the families who'd lived here before Karen's arrival. The Johnsons who ran the local hardware store. The Martinez family whose farm bordered my western property line. Old Pete, who'd been my grandfather's fishing buddy and still remembered when this whole area was just farmland and forest. As we sat around my fire pit, watching the sunset paint the lake in brilliant oranges and purples, Pete told stories about the old days when people respected property lines and minded their own business. Your grandfather would be proud of how... You've kept this place up, Jack, he said, raising his beer toward the lake. He always said this land would be worth fighting for someday. Guess that day's come. Monday morning brought a new level of harassment. I woke up to find orange plastic fencing across my driveway with a sign reading, "Property under review, no trespassing." The irony was rich. Karen was blocking access to my own property with no trespassing signs. I climbed out of my truck and examined the setup. The fencing was anchored with sandbags, clearly a temporary installation designed to make a point rather than actually secure anything. Attached to the fence was another letter, this one hand-delivered and lacking the previous formal tone. Mr. Reynolds, your continued defiance of community standards has forced the board to take protective measures. Until your property status is clarified, we cannot allow unrestricted access that might endanger community members. The road you use to access your cabin crosses through association property. We will provide supervised access twice weekly for essential needs. Supervised access to my own home. I had to laugh at the sheer lunacy of it. I walked around the fence. It only blocked the driveway, not the actual property line, and headed home through the woods. It added 20 minutes to my walk, but it gave me time to think. Karen was escalating quickly, which meant she was either supremely confident or incredibly desperate. My money was on desperate. People who are certain of their legal ground don't resort to playground tactics. When I got home, I called Betty immediately. "They've blocked my driveway," I told her. "Let me guess," she replied. "Orange plastic fencing and a sign about property review." Tuh, how did you know? Because she pulled the same stunt on the Patterson property last month. Turns out, it's Karen's signature move. Don't worry, Jack. Document everything, and let me handle this. By Wednesday, things had gotten worse. I returned from a morning hike to find my electricity had been shut off. The power company truck was just pulling away as I approached through the woods. When I called them, I was told that the account holder had requested disconnection due to unsafe and unpermitted structures. The account holder, not me, despite the fact that I'd been paying the bills for 3 years. Apparently, Karen had convinced someone at the utility company that she had authority over properties in the area. It took 4 hours of phone calls, faxes, and threats of legal action before my power was restored. The customer service representative eventually admitted they'd received official-looking documents from the HOA claiming authority over utility services in the area. Thursday brought a visit from Mike Torres, Karen's apparent second-in-command. Mike was a different breed than Karen, still early 50s, built like an ex-cop with the kind of steady gaze that suggested he'd seen his share of trouble. He arrived alone, walking up my driveway like he owned the place. "Reynolds!" he called out as I emerged from my cabin. "Got a minute to talk?" I gestured to my porch chairs. "Depends what you want to talk about." Mike settled into the chair with a heavy sigh. "Look, I'll cut to the chase. Karen sent me to make you an offer. The association is prepared to purchase your property for fair market value. No hassles, no legal fees, clean transaction." "What makes you think I want to sell?" I asked. Mike looked out at the lake, then back at me. "Between you and me, Karen's got big plans for this area. Development plans. The kind that happen whether individual property owners cooperate or not." The threat was subtle but clear. "That sounds like extortion, Mike." He held up his hands. "I'm just the messenger. But I've seen how these things go in other places. Small landowners versus development companies with deep pockets. It rarely ends well for the little guy." I studied his face. There was something in his expression. Not quite warning, not quite apology. "Tell Karen I'm not interested. This land stays in my family." Mike nodded slowly. "I figured you'd say that. Can I give you some advice, Jack? Document everything. Every interaction, every letter, every incident. You're going to need it." He stood to leave, then paused. "And Jack, be careful. Karen's not just stubborn. She's smart, and she really, really wants this property." After he left, I sat on my porch for a long time thinking about his words. The way he'd said, "be careful," suggested this was more than just a property dispute. I was dealing with someone who saw my land as an obstacle to be removed, not a person to be reasoned with. Friday evening, I discovered just how right Mike had been. I returned from dinner in town to find my cabin door wide open. My first thought was burglary, but nothing seemed to be missing. Instead, everything had been photographed. I could tell, because items that were usually cluttered were arranged neatly, turned at angles that suggested someone had been documenting them. My grandfather's old papers were still scattered across the dining table where I'd left them, but they'd clearly been examined and photographed. The violation felt worse than if someone had actually stolen something. They'd been inside my home, touching my belongings, invading my privacy. I called the sheriff's department immediately. Deputy Williams arrived within 30 minutes. A young woman who took detailed notes and seemed genuinely concerned. "Any idea who might have done this, Mr. Reynolds?" she asked. I explained the situation, with the HOA, the blocked driveway, the utility disconnection. "They're trying to build a case that I'm some kind of squatter," I concluded. "I think they were looking for evidence to support their story here." Deputy Williams photographed everything, dusted for fingerprints on obvious surfaces, and took a formal statement. "Mr. Reynolds, I have to be honest with you. Unless we find clear evidence of who did this, it's going to be hard to prosecute. But I'll make sure this report is thorough. If this is part of a pattern, we'll need documentation." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old cabin made me wonder if someone was outside. I'd gone from feeling like the master of my own domain to feeling like a target in my own home. The worst part was the psychological game Karen was playing. She wasn't just trying to take my property. She was trying to make me feel unsafe, unwelcome, and isolated. By morning, I'd made a decision. It was time to stop playing defense and start playing offense. Karen wanted to fight. Fine. But she was about to learn that my grandfather hadn't just left me land. He'd left me the tools to defend it. As I watched the sunrise over Reynolds Lake, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this whole mess started. Anticipation. The game was about to change, and Karen Steinberg had no idea what was coming. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when I discovered that Karen had hired a private security company to patrol the area around my cabin. Their guards, 2 men in black uniforms with Pine Lake security patches, were positioned at the edge of my property line with clipboards and cameras documenting my every move. When I walked out to get my mail, they followed at a distance, taking notes. When I went to the dock to check my boat, they positioned themselves where they could photograph me through telephoto lenses. The psychological pressure was intentional and relentless. These weren't security guards. They were paid stalkers. I decided to test their boundaries. I walked directly toward them, stopping just short of what I estimated was my property line. "Morning, gentlemen. Can I help you with something?" The older guard, a man in his 50s with the kind of military bearing that suggested ex-police, consulted his clipboard. "We're conducting routine security patrols to ensure community safety. You're advised to maintain appropriate distance from association property." "This is interesting," I replied, pulling out my phone to record. "Could you show me exactly where association property begins?" The younger guard immediately started filming me with his own camera. "Sir, we're going to need you to step back from association personnel." Association personnel standing on my land. I took a step closer, staying well within what I knew were my boundaries based on Betty's survey work. "Actually, you're trespassing. I'm going to need you to leave immediately." The older guard reached for his radio. "Control, we have a hostile property owner refusing to cooperate with security protocols." The absurdity of the situation was almost funny. They'd positioned themselves on my land, declared it association property, and were now calling me hostile for asking them to leave. But the comedy ended when the younger guard stepped forward aggressively. "Sir, you need to calm down and step back right now." Something snapped. After days of harassment, invasion of privacy, and now being threatened on my own land, I lost my temper. "Get the hell off my property now!" I yelled, moving toward them. The younger guard immediately raised his camera, filming my outburst while his partner called for backup. "That's it. Perfect. We got it all on video." They retreated quickly, but I could hear them on their radios. "Hostile landowner made physical threats. Appeared agitated and potentially dangerous. Recommend immediate documentation for legal proceedings." I stood there watching them leave, my heart pounding, knowing I'd just played directly into Karen's hands. Within 2 hours, I received a certified letter delivered by hand. The security incident had been thoroughly documented and would be submitted to local law enforcement as evidence of aggressive and potentially criminal behavior. Furthermore, given my pattern of hostility and non-compliance, the association was implementing enhanced protective measures for community safety. These measures included 24-hour security patrols and restricted access to all disputed areas pending legal resolution. They'd turned my moment of frustration into justification for essentially placing me under surveillance in my own home. That evening, I sat on my porch with a beer, watching the security guards positioned at the edge of my property with their lawn chairs and cooler, clearly settling in for the long haul. Betty had warned me over the phone that afternoon. "Jack, I know it's frustrating, but you absolutely cannot give them any ammunition. Every outburst, every angry word, every moment of lost temper becomes evidence in their narrative that you're an unstable squatter who poses a threat to community safety." She was right. Of course, but knowing that didn't make it easier. The sense of violation and helplessness was overwhelming. They'd turned my peaceful retreat into a fishbowl. As the sun set over the lake, I found myself thinking about my grandfather's stories of dealing with difficult neighbors and property disputes. He'd always emphasized patience and preparation over anger and reaction. "Jackie," he used to say, "angry men make mistakes. Patient men make plans." I'd let my anger get the better of me, and now I was paying the price. But that night, something shifted in my thinking. Instead of focusing on how violated and frustrated I felt, I started thinking about what Karen's escalating behavior was really telling me. She was desperate. Desperate people make mistakes, too. And desperate people with money and lawyers make expensive mistakes. Maybe it was time to let her make a few. I spent that sleepless night walking around my cabin, noting every detail of my property, every boundary marker, every piece of evidence that proved my ownership. By morning, I'd formulated a plan. If Karen wanted to make this a legal battle, I'd give her one, but it would be fought on my terms with my evidence and my documentation. She thought she was dealing with some hermit who'd fold under pressure. She was about to discover that my 3 years of peaceful solitude had given me something she couldn't buy: time to prepare, patience to wait, and clarity about what was really at stake. The game was about to change, and this time I'd be ready for whatever she threw at me. The next morning, I called Betty and said 5 words that marked the beginning of the end. It's time to fight back. Fighting back began with a trip to my grandfather's storage shed, a building I'd barely entered since inheriting the property. What I found there changed everything. Tucked behind old farming equipment and beneath tarps that hadn't been moved in decades was a metal filing cabinet filled with documents I'd never seen. Surveys, correspondence, legal papers, and photographs dating back to the 1940s. But the real treasure was a hand-drawn map from 1968, created by my grandfather himself, showing not just property boundaries, but also detailing every fence post, every stone marker, and every natural landmark that defined his land. More importantly, it showed the original access road and the exact boundaries of what later became the HOA development. What I discovered made my blood run cold and my heart race simultaneously. The road that Karen claimed as association property, the road they blocked with their orange fencing, wasn't just partially on my land. According to the original survey and my grandfather's detailed notes, it was entirely on my land. Every single house in the Pine Lake HOA development accessed their properties via an easement through my land. An easement that, according to the paperwork, had never been legally established. They'd been using my road for 15 years without permission, and now they were trying to claim ownership of it. The audacity was breathtaking. Betty nearly dropped her coffee when I showed her the documents. "Jack, this is incredible. Do you understand what this means?" She spread the papers across her conference table, comparing the old surveys with current property maps. Every time someone drives to their house in that development, they're technically trespassing. The developer who sold them those lots never had the right to grant road access because he didn't own the road. She looked up at me with something approaching glee. Karen's been building her little empire on your land. The implications were staggering. Not only did I have clear ownership of my cabin and lake, but I potentially had legal ground to challenge the entire development's access rights. While Betty dove deeper into the legal research, I decided to do some investigating of my own. I drove into town and had a conversation with Carl Peterson, the longtime manager of the hardware store who'd lived in the area for 40 years. Carl remembered the original development and had some interesting insights. That whole area used to be nothing but forest and farmland. He told me, "Your grandfather's property was the crown jewel, the only spot with natural lake access. When the developer bought up the surrounding parcels in the early 2000s, he kept promising everyone that lake access was included. But I always wondered how he could promise that when he didn't own the lake." Carl pulled out a dusty photo album from behind the counter. "Look here," he said, pointing to a picture from 2005. "This was taken during the construction of the first houses. See that road they're building? That's going right through what I always thought was Reynolds' property." He turned the page. "And here's your grandfather talking to the developer. They had words about something. Your grandfather was pretty upset." The photo showed my grandfather pointing at survey stakes while a man in a hard hat gestured dismissively. Looking at it now, I could almost hear the argument they must have had about the road placement. Armed with this new information, I drove to the county assessor's office to research the development's history. What I found was a pattern of corner cutting and assumptive permits. The original developer, Walker Development Company, which rang a bell I couldn't quite place, had indeed obtained permits to build the houses and establish the community. But the road access permits were based on maps that showed the access road going through dedicated right-of-way. There was no documentation showing that my grandfather had ever dedicated any right-of-ways. In fact, the tax records showed that I'd been paying property taxes on the land under that road for 3 years. That evening, I sat on my dock with the security guards watching me from their lawn chairs at the property edge, and something clicked. Walker Development Company, Gerald Walker, the same man who'd been doing mysterious surveys of my property. According to Betty's research, Karen's development partner wasn't some outside investor. He was the original developer who'd built the HOA community. He'd been planning a return to the area for years, probably waiting for property values to rise enough to justify a major resort development. My cabin and lake weren't just in the way of their plans. They were the centerpiece, the crown jewel that would make their resort development worth hundreds of millions instead of mere tens of millions. I called Betty that night with my discoveries. "Jack, this is big. I mean, really big. If Walker was the original developer and he's working with Karen now, this isn't just about harassing you into selling. This is about covering up 15 years of illegal road usage and setting up for a massive development project." She paused, and I could hear papers shuffling. "I've been researching Walker Development Company. They've done this before. Identify properties with development potential, harass the owners into selling for below market value, then flip them to major resort chains. But they've never tried it with a property where they don't have legal road access." The next morning brought a new development. Mike Torres appeared at my door, but this time he looked nervous rather than threatening. "Jack, we need to talk. Off the record." I invited him in for coffee, curious about his change in tone. "Look, I need to tell you something. I used to be a cop detective, actually, before I retired here. Karen hired me for security consulting, but what she's really asked me to do," he paused, looking uncomfortable, "she wants me to find ways to prove you don't legally own this property. She's convinced there's some loophole, some missed payment, something that would invalidate your claim." Mike continued, "But Jack, I've done my research. Your family's ownership is rock solid, more than solid. It's bulletproof. But here's what you need to know. Karen's not working alone, and she's got a lot more money behind this than just HOA dues. She's got development partners, and they're planning something big, something that requires your property." He looked out at the lake. "Whatever you're planning to do, you better do it fast because Karen's getting desperate. And desperate people with money do dangerous things." His warning sent chills down my spine, but it also crystallized my resolve. It was time to stop playing defense and start playing offense. The evidence was mounting. The legal grounds were clear, and Karen Steinberg was about to discover that she'd picked a fight with the wrong property owner. The counterattack began with a letter that Betty and I crafted carefully. But it wasn't addressed to Karen. It was addressed to every homeowner in the Pine Lake development, and it was delivered by certified mail on a Monday morning. The letter was professional, factual, and devastating. "Dear Pine Lake residents," it began, "you may not be aware that your access road is located entirely on private property belonging to Jack Reynolds. Recent research has revealed that the easement rights necessary for your road access were never legally established. As the property owner, Mr. Reynolds is required to inform you that continued use of this road without proper legal documentation constitutes trespassing. We are providing 30 days' notice to establish proper easement agreements or seek alternative access to your property." The response was immediate and explosive. By Tuesday afternoon, Betty's office was flooded with calls from panicked homeowners who suddenly realized their property values depended on road access they didn't legally have. "I've never seen anything like it," Betty told me with barely contained excitement. "These people just learned that their $500,000 homes might be landlocked if you decide to block that road. 3 of them have already asked to meet with us directly, bypassing the HOA entirely." The letter had accomplished exactly what we'd hoped. It separated the homeowners from Karen's agenda and forced everyone to confront the reality of the situation. Wednesday brought an emergency HOA meeting, which I decided to attend. I walked into the community center, built ironically on land that my grandfather had sold to the county in 1975, to find 45 furious residents and one very pale Karen Steinberg. The moment I entered, the room fell silent. Karen, standing at the front with a stack of papers, tried to regain control. "As I was saying, Mr. Reynolds's claims are baseless legal maneuvering designed to intimidate this community. Our legal team has assured us that the road access rights are grandfathered and unassailable." Her voice was steady, but I could see her hand shaking. That's when I stood up. "Actually, Karen, I'd like to address that point directly." The room turned to me. I kept my voice calm and measured. "I have in my possession the original 1968 survey of my grandfather's property signed by a licensed surveyor and filed with the county. I also have tax records showing that my family has paid property taxes on the land under your access road for over 50 years. Furthermore, I have the original development permits, which show that Walker Development Company promised road access through land they didn't own and never acquired legal rights to use." I paused, letting that sink in. I'm not here to intimidate anyone. I'm here to establish fact. A man in the front row, whom I recognized as Dr. Martinez from the medical clinic, raised his hand. "Are you saying our homes might be landlocked?" Before I could answer, Karen interjected. "This is exactly the kind of fear-mongering we expected. Mr. Reynolds doesn't have the legal standing to." "Actually," I interrupted politely, "I have every legal standing. I own the road you've been using. I own it outright with clear title, and I have documentation proving it." I pulled out copies of the key documents Betty and I had prepared. "But I'm not here to threaten anyone's access to their homes. I'm here to resolve this properly." The mood in the room shifted palpably. These weren't conspirators in Karen's scheme. They were people who'd bought homes in good faith and suddenly found themselves in legal limbo. An elderly woman near the back raised her hand. "What do you want from us, Mr. Reynolds?" It was the question I'd been hoping for. "I want to establish proper easement agreements with each homeowner who needs road access. Reasonable agreements that protect your access rights while acknowledging the property ownership reality. And I want the harassment to stop immediately." The murmur of agreement that rippled through the room told me I'd struck the right tone. Karen's face was flushed red as she tried to regain control of the meeting. Ladies and gentlemen, please don't let fear cloud your judgment. Mr. Reynolds is trying to extort this community by threatening our basic access rights. The HOA board has already contacted our legal team, and we're prepared to fight this baseless claim in court. But her words fell flat. The residents weren't looking at her anymore. They were looking at each other, calculating legal costs, property values, and the risk of being cut off from their homes. Dr. Martinez stood up. Karen, with all due respect, maybe we should hear what Mr. Reynolds is proposing before we start talking about court battles we might not win. That's when Gerald Walker made his entrance. I recognized him immediately from the photographs in my grandfather's collection. Older now, but the same arrogant bearing, the same dismissive gesture. "Sorry I'm late," he announced, striding to the front of the room like he owned the place. "I'm Gerald Walker, development consultant to the HOA. I've been reviewing this situation, and I can assure everyone that Mr. Reynolds's claims are without merit." He turned to face me directly. "No tuituituits. In fact, I was involved in the original development of this community. The road access rights were properly established and documented." The room went quiet again, but this time the energy was different. This felt like a confrontation that had been building for decades. I stood up slowly, maintaining eye contact with Walker. "Mr. Walker, I'm curious about something. In the original development permits you filed, you promised lake access to homeowners, but you never owned lake access rights. How exactly did you plan to deliver on that promise?" Walker's confident smile faltered slightly. "Lake access was to be negotiated separately with the adjacent property owner, a grandfather, if necessary. But you never negotiated anything with him. In fact, according to his papers, he specifically refused to sell or lease any lake access. So, you sold houses, promising amenities you couldn't deliver. And now, 15 years later, you're back to finish what you started." The room was dead silent now, and I could see understanding dawning on several faces. This wasn't just about road access. It was about a development scheme that had been in motion for over a decade. Karen tried to interject, but Walker held up a hand to silence her. That gesture told me everything I needed to know about their relationship. Karen wasn't the mastermind. She was the front person. Walker was calling the shots. "Mr. Reynolds," Walker said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "I think you misunderstand the situation. Property rights are complex things. Sometimes what people think they own and what they actually own are very different." It wasn't quite a threat, but the implication was clear. "You're right about that, Mr. Walker. Sometimes people think they can claim ownership through intimidation and harassment. But clear title is clear title, and I have very clear title to my land, my lake, and that road you've been using." The meeting was spiraling out of Karen and Walker's control, and I could see them exchanging glances that suggested their simple intimidation strategy wasn't working anymore. The final confrontation came sooner than I expected. 3 days after the disastrous HOA meeting, I woke to find Walker himself outside my cabin, standing on my dock like he belonged there. Gone was the polished developer persona from the meeting. This was a man who looked like he hadn't slept well in his expensive suit, couldn't hide the desperation in his eyes. "Reynolds," he called out as I stepped onto my porch. "We need to talk, just you and me." I walked down to the dock slowly, keeping my hands visible and my voice calm. "You're trespassing, Walker, again." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Let's cut the legal. You know what I want, and I know what you want. Let's make a deal." "What I want is for you to leave my property," I replied. "What you want is something that's not for sale." Walker turned to face the lake, gesturing at the view that had captivated my family for generations. "Do you have any idea what this place could be worth? I'm talking about a development that could transform this entire region. Resort, spa, championship golf course, luxury condominiums. We're looking at a $200 million project, Reynolds. And you're standing in the way for what? Sentiment? His tone was dismissive, but I could hear the edge of frustration underneath. I'm not standing in the way of anything, Walker. I'm just not moving. That's when Walker played what he thought was his trump card. He pulled a folder from his briefcase and spread documents across my picnic table. These are geological surveys, environmental impact studies, market analyses. This property is sitting on undeveloped lakefront that's worth 50 times what your grandfather paid for it. But here's what you don't understand, Reynolds. Development happens whether individual property owners cooperate or not. Eminent domain, public use, economic development zones. There are ways around stubborn landowners. I glanced at the documents without touching them. Is that a threat, Walker? It's reality. Either you sell to us willingly at a generous price, or the county will eventually take your property for public use and pay you fair market value. Which do you think works out better for you? I looked at Walker for a long moment, then started laughing. Really laughing. He stepped back, clearly disturbed by my reaction. Something funny, Reynolds. Yeah, actually. You see, Walker, you made a fundamental mistake. You assumed I'm some ignorant hermit who doesn't understand property law or development rights. I walked to my cabin and returned with a thick folder of my own. While you've been playing games with Karen and her HOA, I've been doing research. Real research. I opened the folder to reveal documents that made Walker's face go white. Recognize these original geological surveys from 1968, environmental studies from the 70s, fish and wildlife habitat assessments. What are you getting at? Walker asked, but his voice had lost all its confidence. I'm getting at the fact that my grandfather wasn't just a farmer Walker. He was a smart man who loved this land enough to protect it permanently. I pulled out a document with official seals and signatures. Sadeed Hajjafiris Sikerint. This is a conservation easement filed in 1975 and updated in 1989. My grandfather donated the development rights on this property to the State Environmental Trust. The land can never be commercially developed ever. Walker's hands were shaking as he reached for the document. This can't be legal. It's completely legal. Ironclad legal. Reviewed by environmental lawyers and upheld by state courts. You can't develop this land, Walker. No one can. Not now. Not ever. The implications crashed over Walker like a tsunami. 15 years of planning, millions in preliminary investment, promises to financial backers, contracts with resort companies, all of it worthless. His entire scheme had been built on land that was legally undevelopable. But the road access, he stammered. The HOA could force— You want to know the best part? Since you never legally established road access, and since my land is protected by conservation easement, I can legally close that road any time I want. Your entire development doesn't just lose its centerpiece, it loses access entirely. That's when Walker lost it completely. You son of a— Do you have any idea how much money is involved here? How many people are depending on this project? He grabbed the conservation easement document, studying it frantically. There has to be a way around this. Environmental appeals, grandfather clauses, something. But I could see in his eyes that he knew it was over. The conservation easement wasn't just legal protection. It was my grandfather's final word on what this land meant to our family. Walker, let me make this simple for you. Pack up your schemes, call off your attack dog, Karen, and get off my property permanently. The aftermath unfolded exactly as I'd hoped. Walker's development company collapsed within weeks when their financial backers learned about the conservation easement. Karen, left without her development partner and facing lawsuits from HOA members who'd discovered they'd been paying fees for illegal activities, fled to Florida to start fresh. The homeowners, who'd actually bought their houses in good faith, worked with Betty and me to establish proper easement agreements, paying reasonable annual fees for road access while acknowledging my ownership. Mike Torres became the new HOA president with a mandate to run the organization legally and transparently. 6 months later, I was back on my dock with a fishing line in the water, and Mike Torres sitting beside me with his own rod. "You know," Mike said, casting his line into the calm water, "when I first came here to threaten you, I never imagined it would end like this." "How did you think it would end?" I asked. He chuckled. "With you selling out and disappearing, that's how these things usually go. Big money wins, little guy loses, life moves on. The difference is I never was the little guy. I just look like one." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, two men who discovered they had more in common than they'd expected. "Mike, can I ask you something? What made you switch sides?" He thought about it for a long moment. "When I realized that Karen and Walker didn't just want your land, they were willing to destroy anyone who got in their way, including the people who'd trusted them to protect their community." As the sun set over Reynolds Lake, officially renamed and registered as such in honor of my grandfather's conservation foresight, I reflected on how the entire conflict had unfolded. Karen had seen my cabin and immediately envisioned dollar signs. Walker had seen my lake and imagined resort profits. Neither of them had understood what they were really looking at: land protected by love, defended by law, and held in trust for future generations. My grandfather's ultimate victory hadn't been keeping the land in the family. It had been ensuring that no amount of money or pressure could ever transform it into something else. The final irony came a year later when the State Environmental Department designated my property as a protected wildlife corridor and offered to buy additional conservation easements from surrounding landowners. Property values in the area actually increased because of the protected status, making the remaining homeowners very happy with their investment. Karen's scheme to increase property values through development had backfired spectacularly, while my grandfather's conservation easement had achieved the same goal through protection. Sometimes the best defense really is a good offense, especially when your grandfather spent 30 years preparing for a fight he knew was coming. These days, I still fish from my dock every morning, still enjoy the peace and solitude my grandfather loved about this place. But now I also host occasional barbecues for neighbors who've become genuine friends, and I take pride in educating visitors about conservation easements and property protection strategies. The lake is busier now with families who appreciate what they've preserved rather than developers who see only what they can exploit. And every time someone new moves to the area and asks about the history of Reynolds Lake, I tell them the story of how my grandfather outwitted developers who wouldn't be born for another 30 years. Sometimes the best revenge is a life well lived on land well protected. If there's a lesson in all this, it's simple. Know what you own, understand what you're protecting, and never underestimate the power of patience and preparation. Karen and Walker thought they were playing a short game for quick profits. My grandfather played a long game for permanent protection. In the end, patience and planning beat pressure and intimidation every single time. Oh, and one more thing. If someone in an expensive suit shows up uninvited to tell you what you can't do on your own land, demand to see their deed. Chances are they don't have one. You've reached the end of this tale, but trust us, the rabbit hole goes way deeper. Click another HOA Tragedies video and fall further in.